Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. We are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. Good morning. I'm Mary Massey, joined by co-host John SAKOWICZ. Hey, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience listening to the broadcast here in Northern California, and also to our audience listening throughout the country on the web. We stream live from the web at kmud.org.
Opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the board, staff, underwriters, volunteers, or members of KMUD. Today's program will be archived at KMUD and the Heroes and Patriots social media page, and of course our website, heroespatriots.org. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests. That number, 707-923-3911. So, affirmative action, which began in 1961, involves sets of policies and practices within a government or organization seeking to include particular groups based on their gender, race, sexuality, creed, or nationality in areas which such groups are underrepresented, such as education and employment. The Supreme Court is examining affirmative action with respect to admissions policies for both Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, or UNC. To help us understand what this may mean going forward, John and I are speaking with returning guest, Dr. Francis Boyle. Francis Boyle is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law. His areas of expertise include constitutional law, human rights, jurisprudence, and U.S. foreign affairs. Over his career, he has advised numerous international bodies in the areas of human rights, war crimes, genocide, nuclear policy, and biowarfare. He earned both his graduate and postgraduate degrees at Harvard. Dr. Boyle, welcome to the program.
Well, Mary and John, thank you very much for having me on again, and my best to your listening audience.
We are so happy to have you back, Professor Boyle. Let's start at Harvard. You're a Harvard alumnus. What was Harvard like back when you were in school, and what has it been since affirmative action, and where is Harvard headed now?
Well, John, I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but I guess it is relevant to the analysis, certainly, of the Harvard case. I spent 7 years at Harvard. I have 3 degrees from Harvard, a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, and an AM and PhD in political science from the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Department of Government, where Harvard trains future professors of political science. I spent 2 years teaching undergraduates at Harvard and 2 years at the Harvard Center for International Affairs, 1 year on their executive committee. What can I say? I was also chair of the Harvard Law School Fund Campaign for Greater Illinois. So I have had experience with Harvard. Yes, indeed, the founder of the idea of affirmative action was my teacher, mentor, and friend at Harvard Law School, Professor Clyde Ferguson. He was the first tenured African-American full professor at Harvard Law School. So he taught me my course on international human rights law. So I did study this whole issue with Clyde. As for the current litigation, this litigation was, I would say, deliberately, maliciously set up by well-known opponents of affirmative action as a test case, figuring that given the current constituents of the U.S. Supreme Court, they would be able to get affirmative action overturned. And indeed, 6 members of the U.S. Supreme Court are members of the Federalist Society, which we discussed before, which is right-wing, racist, bigoted, reactionary, elitist, sexist, homophobic, totalitarian, anti-labor, anti-union. So from what I know of these 6 justices, and also I couldn't listen to the hearings on Monday. I do all my teaching on Monday and Tuesday, but it does appear that they are going to overrule affirmative action by the end of this term. Based on my experiences at Harvard, and please understand, you can read the New York Times today. They have an article on the experience of minority students at Harvard. Well, I can't speak for them. I'm Irish American, but based on my experience at Harvard, I think Harvard has done the best they could as an institution to recruit some of the best minority students they can to go and study at Harvard. For example, President and Mrs. Obama were behind me at Harvard Law School. President Obama and I had the same jurisprudence teacher. Justice Jackson, now on the U.S. Supreme Court, behind me at Harvard Law School. So I personally think Harvard's done a great job in this area from my perspective. When the students get there, I take it, and it's the case here, they do feel alienated by the environment. That, you know, I can't speak to that. They'd have to speak to themselves.
So, was affirmative action working, in your opinion? And I want you to fold into your answer that it's not just about race. In Ivy League institutions like Harvard, it's all about financial aid. Harvard has an endowment where it can financially assist low-income students, many of whom are students of color.
Well, Mary, we first have to understand what affirmative action was all about. As Clyde Ferguson, and by the way, Clyde graduated from Harvard Law School. He was a teaching fellow at Harvard Law School, and then he returned to become a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, and then became a full tenured professor, and then the Henry L. Stimson professor. But as Clyde saw affirmative action, it was basically rectificatory justice that I lecture on in my course in jurisprudence when it comes to Aristotle, Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, remedial justice, that African Americans, their ancestors, were the only people here in the United States, the only minority group whose ancestors were kidnapped from Africa, brought here and reduced to slavery, starting in 1619. No other minority group has been treated that way. The only minority group treated even worse were American Indians, and they were exterminated, and they now live in Bantustans. So as Clyde saw it, there had to be rectification here for the way African Americans have uniquely been treated in this country to their detriment. I mean, they were slaves until the 13th Amendment, then the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. Then after liberation as slaves, they were basically reduced to serfdom. With de jure apartheid against African Americans. And I studied the Apartheid Convention with Clyde. And that continued until this de jure apartheid against African Americans continued until the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Clyde was working at the Department of Justice at that time, and helped draft it along with my friend Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General of the United States. Then came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Ramsey as Attorney General, just the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts just gutted Section 5 of the U.S. Civil Rights Act. And, Roberts is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He knows better. And then the U.S. Voting Rights Act of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So it wasn't until then that I think one could say, at least I could say as an expert on human rights, that African Americans were no longer living in a de jure apartheid state. But of course, I think de facto apartheid against African Americans continues today. So that is what affirmative action was all about, as envisioned by Clyde Ferguson.
And given all of that history, why were their opponents? What were they saying, and what was their position?
Yeah, what were they arguing?
Well, they're arguing that affirmative action is racial discrimination. But if Clyde was involved in the drafting for the United States government, by the way, of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the United States is a party to this treaty. And if you read Article 1, Paragraph 4 of that treaty that Clyde put in there, it says quite clearly that affirmative action is not racial discrimination. But that's the argument they're using, and indeed, perversely, they're using Brown versus the Board of Education to support this position. What can I say? But there it is.
Let's talk about the cases in particular. What is the Fisher case, and how is the ruling in the Fisher case forecasted? If not, it will invite a larger challenge to overturn Gutter versus Bollinger.
Well, we really have to go back to the Bakke decision written by Justice Powell, who's a segregationalist between you and me and a racist for the court, where the whole purpose of affirmative action was shifted over from remedial justice, rectificatory justice, as envisioned by Clyde, to diversity. Well, from my perspective, I think from Clyde's perspective, that argument by Powell was basically, well, it's good for the white students to have black students around. So it was a major shift in the purpose of affirmative action, and that was what was being argued Monday at the Supreme Court. And it does appear that the 6 Federalist Society justices didn't accept that argument, aren't going to accept that argument. But again, the real basis for affirmative action is not so much diversity. I'm in favor of diversity myself, but rectificatory justice and remedial justice for African Americans, and that is going to be struck down. I think that's pretty clear.
It's 15 minutes past the hour. We are speaking with Dr. Francis Boyle about the case before the Supreme Court on affirmative action for both Harvard and UNC. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, that number is 707-923-3911, and we welcome brief comments and questions, so please do. So what do you see as the outcome of this, and why is this happening now, and why does it matter?
Well, I think it matters an enormous amount, not just for African Americans and other people of color, but for the future of this country. I'm afraid you're going to see in these decisions, Harvard and North Carolina, they're different. Harvard is a private institution, so that case involves a federal statute on use of federal funds. North Carolina is a public institution. That case involves the Equal Protection Clause and the federal statute. So I'm afraid the Supreme Court is going to make a very broad ruling striking down all forms of affirmative action across the board here in the United States, to the grave disadvantage, certainly, of African Americans and other minorities. That appears to be the direction in which we are going.
Professor Boyle, you've written that your mentor, the late great Clyde Ferguson at Harvard, had negotiated the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination on behalf of the United States government, to which the United States government is a signatory. And Clyde included affirmative action right there in Article 1, subsection 4 of the convention. And because the United States is a contracting party to this convention, which is kind of like a treaty, it's legal and binding, that no matter what the Supreme Court does to affirmative action, it shall remain binding international law of the United States government to enforce affirmative action. There's a great irony in that, is there not?
It is. As I see it, having studied affirmative action with Clyde, I think it was 1975, that at Harvard Law School, that it is the Harvard case, in part, significant part, that will be used to overturn affirmative action. Right. I don't know what to say about it. It's a very sad day for me personally, to be sure.
This is in the area of education, those that are underrepresented. What about in the workplace? If this goes through, if they do reverse this, what about those who are in employment situations and are minorities?
And housing.
And housing, yes.
Well, there is the Fair Housing Act that is still there, but employment, you're right, Mary, because in the UNC case, the Equal Protection Clause is there. And the Supreme Court could rule, I think they will rule, that affirmative action violates the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. And at that point, any type of affirmative action can then be struck down. That's correct across the country, yes.
Wow. We have a caller for you, Professor Boyle. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Professor Boyle, for this really important conversation, and also for mentioning and celebrating Clyde Ferguson. He was responsible for so much positive good in this country when he was at Harvard, but also when he was at Howard. I wanted to ask
where he
you
was dean, by the way. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, no, he was really important. I know from the Ford Foundation. I don't want to talk too much about this because a whole show could be devoted to Clyde. Many shows could be devoted to him, but he influenced major litigation and policy all over the country for so long. So, what are the implications? And I'd like to pursue Mary's question just now, going beyond, and John's as well, both for not only education in the workplace. If you could go into more depth, but what it might mean for societal relationships in this country, and then the implications abroad, because certainly the civil rights movement and its relationship to South Africa is important, but there are other settings where racial justice is under threat as well. So if you could deepen the conversation on the implications.
I studied the criminal apartheid regime in South Africa with Clyde, and got involved in that movement as well, thanks to Clyde. I regret to say the consequences here could be, depending on what the Supreme Court says, and if the Supreme Court does come out 6-3, saying that equal protection that if all forms of affirmative action violate the Equal Protection Clause, I'm afraid it could be extremely severe consequences for African Americans and other people of color here in the United States. Basically, then it gives a green light to anyone in America who wants to roll back the situation from what it is today. Now, many employers might conclude, well, no, they like the situation the way it is because America is become a multicultural society, and for economic reasons, we need affirmative action. But for others, they'll just say good riddance and use this as an excuse. So I can't say I'm overly optimistic, and I'm sure this Clyde Ferguson right now is crying in heaven. That's all I can say.
What are the implications for immigration, Professor Boyle?
That's a very complicated situation in its own right. Certainly, we need immigration reform here in the United States, but it does not appear this is going to happen, given the the anti-immigrant sentiment here in the United States that certainly was inflamed by President Trump and is still being inflamed by President Trump today. And many of these sources of opposition overlap with each other against immigration, against affirmative action, things of this nature. Right. So this will be a fillip, I'm afraid, for discrimination against people of color, not only in this country but getting into this country.
And let's look at some remedies. You've written widely about what's called counterpacting the court. Where do we go from here?
Boy, that's a tough question, John. I guess I will have to read the decision when it comes down. But yes, we discussed this before. I have argued that the United States Supreme Court has been packed consistently by Republican administrations going back to the Reagan administration and Ed Meese. And you know all about Ed Meese out there in California, with members of the Federalist Society, founded by Meese and Bob Bork. And these justices, and by the way, all the three Trump appointees were, this was the case for 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush Sr., 8 years of Bush Jr., and 4 years of Trump from the Federalist Society. And I've been an opponent to the Federalist Society since about 1986, and Art is known as one of the foremost adversaries of them in the American Legal Academy. Indeed, Bob Bork put out a mass mailing fundraising letter against me back in 1999 to 25,000 members of the Federalist Society. These people are right-wing, racist, bigoted, reactionary, elitist, warmongering, sexist, homophobic, totalitarian, anti-labor, and anti-union. This is what we are dealing with on the U.S. Supreme Court. So it was my advice that we really need to counterpack the Supreme Court. And like President Franklin Roosevelt threatened to do when he faced the reactionary Supreme Court back in the 1930s against his policies, his New Deal policies. We have to understand that these 6 Federalist Society justices who, by the way, just overturned Roe versus Wade. We discussed that. Right? I think we were on discussing that. They just started their agenda. They're just starting here.
Well, that was my next question. Where are we going after Roe v. Wade and now affirmative action? What do you think is next to hit the chopping block?
Oh, sure. Brown versus the board will go. They're against Brown versus the board. The Federalist Society practiced moot courts in overturning Brown versus the board. Justice Scalia, a member, faculty advisor to the Federalist Society, admitted that if he had been on the court at that time, he would have overruled Brown versus the board. So, Mary, basically, anything we can go back not only to before Brown versus the board, but Judge Lawrence Walsh pointed out, and Judge Walsh was a pillar of the Republican Party. Judge Lawrence Walsh pointed out that the agenda of the Federalist Society is to undo Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, to take the U.S. Supreme Court back to the bad old days of the Herbert Hoover Supreme Court. That is their ultimate agenda. And again, Judge Walsh said that. He was Deputy Attorney General for President Eisenhower. He was president of the American Bar Association, a pillar of the Republican Party. He compared the Federalist Society to the Ku Klux Klan. That's his opinion. That was his opinion, yes. And Bork, in his mass mailing letter to the Federalist Society, condemned Judge Walsh and me together. I thought that was a great honor to be associated with a judge of the caliber of Lawrence Walsh. And by the way, Reagan appointed Judge Walsh as independent counsel in the Iran-Contra scandal, and Judge Walsh found that Mies was the architect of the cover-up. But we have to understand these 6 justices there on the Supreme Court and large numbers of federal judges appointed by the Republicans are members of or affiliated with the Federalist Society. So they've been stacking our federal courts with these people. Likewise, today you read the New York Times, there's a big article on battles in state courts. Right. Decades ago, the Federalist Society also targeted state court judges and to put their people on state courts. Regretfully, the Democrats weren't paying attention, whereas the Federalist Society and the Republicans were paying attention quite some time ago. So you see Federalist Society judges and justices at many of state Supreme Courts and appellate courts. Yes.
Final question, Professor Boyle, and I want to thank you so much for appearing as a guest again on our show. You're wildly popular with our audience, by the way. We see we get the emails, and not just here at the station, but on our YouTube channel and on our website. And you are clearly one of our most popular guests. So thank you for your time. My last question is, and it relates to counterpacking, but it doesn't. Would you be in favor of a constitutional amendment that would eliminate life tenure for Supreme Court justices?
Well, of course I would, but the odds of getting a Supreme Court, a constitutional amendment are minimal. So that's why counterpacking does not require a constitutional amendment, that the number of justices on the Supreme Court is controlled by Congress. They can increase that number if they want to. I think that's more likely than getting a constitutional amendment. By the way, I also wanted to point out one other issue. Clyde's endorsement of affirmative action in the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was then picked up and carried over into the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And it expressly says that affirmative action on behalf of women is not discrimination. And, years ago, one of the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women, the studies show. So to some extent, we owe that to Clyde as well. So I only have a limited amount of time here, and our first caller, pointed out the contributions Clyde made to civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights as well. So it's a very sad day, and as I said, I'm afraid Clyde is crying in heaven right now.
Professor Boyle, we thank you as always. Extremely important and interesting information for all of our listeners. I want to say that you are the professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law, and you've been involved in constitutional law, human rights, jurisprudence, and U.S. foreign affairs. Thank you so much for being our first guest on today's program.
Well, thank you. And I did want to say, whenever this decision comes down, probably before July 1, I'll read it and then see what we can do.
Yeah.
I can't predict anything right now.
That would be great.
We would love to have you back. Thank you so much, Francis Boyle.
We're going to take a brief pause and be back with our next guest, Professor Noreen Sugrue.
Oh, you're slick. You investors in hate.
So, welcome back to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. It is 9:33 in Northern California, and we're beginning our second segment of today's show with Professor Noreen Sugrue. Professor Sugrue is currently the Director of Research at the Latino Policy Forum. Prior to joining the Latino Policy Forum, she was a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Some of her overarching themes in her writings include answering the questions of who gets what and why, and what policies and incentives need to be implemented to ensure greater equality. And we're going to use that as sort of a template as we talk about our subject about Latinos and COVID, and how long COVID has affected the Latino community. Professor Sugrue, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm no longer Professor Sugrue. I no longer work at the University of Illinois. I'm just the Director of Research now. So Noreen is great.
Noreen?
Noreen. Just Noreen is good.
Oh, wonderful. I think this name is also Irish. We had Francis Boyle on just a second ago. You're also an Irish American, are you not?
Half Irish American, half Sicilian American.
Oh, John. John is half Italian. Well, thank you for being our first guest for the first time on our show. And I wondered if you might just give an overview of what the Latino Policy Forum is and what it's designed to do for that population. And then we'll get into the subject of COVID and how it has affected that community.
Sure. The Latino Policy Forum is located in Chicago, and they are a policy and advocacy group that works on issues aimed at creating equity and equal opportunity and equitable opportunity for Latinos, with a special emphasis around issues of education, in particular early childhood education, housing, immigration, and obviously COVID touches on all of those plus many other issues, and that is how we began working on COVID issues. It really is designed to use data to drive policy change at the state, county, and city level, as well as use data to drive advocacy for greater equity for Latinos.
Right. So take us back to 2020 when COVID was really surfacing in the general population. What was happening in the Latino population?
What was really interesting in that first few months, the Latino story was really not being told. And we were hearing from Latino physicians and nurses, people who were running the federally qualified clinics in communities that were serving Latinos. We were hearing that Latinos were getting sick and actually dying at much greater rates than were being reported. And we began to look at the data and ask the question, not what percent of the cases are affecting Latinos, but what were the rates in the Latino community. And as it became more evident that Latinos were actually having the rates of COVID were highest among all racial and ethnic groups in the Latino community in Illinois, that began to percolate to the top. And the death rates also began to rise because, as we know, death rates lag behind case rates. And the Latino community was affected primarily for two reasons. One is the occupations in which large numbers of Latinos work. They were essential workers, many of whom had constant exposure. Latinos also often work multiple jobs, and they were multiple high-risk jobs, and they were going home to housing situations that were overcrowded. And so the public health mantra of isolate was very, very difficult for many Latino families to implement.
We're talking about COVID. Let's talk about long COVID. What is long COVID, and how does that raise the issue about how we view the definition of disability?
Okay, I can talk a little bit about that. I'm not a disability expert, and the forum does not work on disability issues. But what we can do is sort of point the lens as to how we need to be thinking about this if we are going to have our elected officials figure out how to ensure that people who come down with long COVID have access to resources so that they are not more economically impacted than they already are. So long COVID is really a constellation of conditions, physical and psychological, not cases, they're not diseases, they're really conditions. So it's extreme fatigue, unable to work, unable to lift, hard to breathe, unable to make a flight of stairs, problems with cognitive processing. All of those conditions affect people, and the latest numbers out of Brookings indicate that it's about 1 in 4 Latino families that have somebody experiencing long COVID. When those conditions hit people, their ability to work and their ability to provide housing and food and healthcare and access to education that is paying for what needs to be paid for becomes severely limited. And if we're going to think about how to mitigate COVID's impact, we have got to understand that what we know about COVID is constantly emerging, but if people are not able to work, that means they are disabled. And this becomes extremely important, especially it's important for all groups. And the forum puts the Latino lens on issues, and for the Latino community, part of the reason it is so important is because of the inability of people to take care of their families, to ensure that housing is secure, because Latinos have the lowest rates of participation in publicly funded social welfare programs. And also, many definitions of disability do not take into account people who may not be U.S. citizens. There's all kinds of vague rules, and there's questions about how that applies. And so we have to begin rethinking disability, not just in terms of who's disabled, but what metric we use that allow people to qualify for disability if we're going to have an equitable economic response.
1 in 4 Latinos in Colorado were, in a recent study, were found to be suffering from long-term COVID. The study is called Colorado's Latino Policy Agenda 2022. We'll post that study to our website. Dr. Sugrue, could you please talk about that study, some of its findings, and what are the implications?
I did not conduct that study nor participate in it. That was done. The lead on that was Gabriel Sanchez from the Brookings Institute and the University of New Mexico. We collaborated with them, and they released that at the same time that we released our report, and we did this national webinar with Brookings. The implications of that are really long range, both short and long range. In the short run, if you have 1 in 4 people in the Latino community who are unable to work full time, who need health care, who need help, who may need help with activities of daily living, those costs are enormous at the macro level, but they are also incredibly enormous at the micro level. And these are families. Let's keep in mind a little background. At the beginning of the pandemic, less than half of Latino families had more than $400 cash reserve to get through. If you've got families where you've got 1 in 4 people with COVID, you've got to figure out a way to help these folks short term to get through this, to see if these long COVID symptoms are permanent or long term. But in terms of long-term consequence, it's going to impact the ability of families to save for retirement, to accumulate money to purchase homes. And we know homes are the single most important vehicle for wealth accumulation for the non-wealthy. It also raises questions about, is there going to be money to ensure that their children are able to secure higher education? We are in a knowledge economy. We need people to be educated beyond high school. That takes resources. All of the economic impacts of long COVID are going to cascade beyond the next 2 years. There are potentially very severe long-term economic consequences for the Latino community. And because the Latino community has the highest rate of labor force participation, because the Latino community's purchasing power and consumer spending power are greater than any other racial or ethnic group and projected to grow, the entire country, the entire economic system is really dependent on the Latino community being able to fully participate in the economic and social life of the country.
And is there any entity or governmental institution, organizations that is now addressing this, what we're all facing ahead?
Well, in Illinois, very honestly, the state has been quite responsive. When, for example, the first round of assistance dollars were people who came from mixed status families, that it has somebody who was not an American citizen, may or may not have been documented, when they were eliminated from the housing help. State of Illinois put in $500 million to help those families with housing. So what's happening at the federal level depends basically on who's in charge. And what we have seen, at least here in Illinois, is that the state, the city, and the county have been extremely responsive when it has been brought to their attention and tried to step in. No state can do what the federal government can do, obviously.
Right.
But they step in and say, we've got to do something. We cannot ignore people. And we recognize the importance of all people, regardless of immigration status.
It seems to me that at the heart of the problem is diagnosing long-term COVID. What are some of the issues surrounding that, the diagnosis of long-term COVID, say in the Latino community versus the non-Latino community?
Well, I can't speak to the clinical issues of the problems of defining long COVID, but I can speak to some of the socioeconomic challenges. Latinos have the lowest rates of health insurance among all racial and ethnic groups. In order to be diagnosed with long COVID, you have to access physicians, clinics, specialists. Those all take money. And if you don't have insurance or you don't have really good health insurance, unless you are really, really sick or really, really incapacitated, you're probably not going to be diagnosed with long COVID because you're simply not going to be able to access the healthcare system. And that becomes a problem for people with what we would call long COVID that is limiting but not completely debilitating. And it's that limiting group where there's a problem, because I may have long COVID and be limited, and that means I can work part-time but not full-time, but I don't feel I have the money to go and see the specialist that can help me figure out if I have long COVID. And so
that's why I asked the question about redefining the term disability as applies to long-term COVID. I think we have a caller with a question.
Yes, go ahead with your question.
Hello, Noreen. My name is Pat, and I'm really interested in what you're saying in terms of the differential impact of both COVID and long-term COVID on the Latino community. It's really important to give even more publicity to this, and I appreciate what you're doing. Could you talk a little bit about the impact on K through 12 education? We just had the test results that showed how much of a decline there was in the general American population, but I'm just thinking the socioeconomic implications that you're talking about will be even more reinforced by the educational decline. Could you talk more about how it affected the Latino community, children particularly?
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. We know that there has been a loss of opportunity for educational gain, that there's been lost educational opportunities. We also know that, depending on the school district, a lot is being done. What we also know is that children for whom English is a second language, the English language learners, we know that they suffered a loss of educational opportunity that is greater than kids who English was a primary language. What we really need to do is understand that we have to go in and give these kids and their families the support they need to ensure that there are no more lost opportunities.
Let's talk about another possible remedy, advocating for universal sick leave. You have written that the most basic but most impactful policy recommendation that you could that probably comes out of this Colorado study is universal sick leave, especially if you want someone who is sick coming to work and infecting the workplace. Talk to us a little bit about where we're headed with universal sick leave.
Very honestly, I don't see it on the horizon in the United States. I mean, we're about to see, if the polls are right, we're about to see a red tsunami next week. I don't see universal sick leave. What I would hope would happen is that private sector businesses would understand that it is in their interest to come up with policies that government has failed to come up with. I mean, it's in a business's interest not to have sick people coming to work.
Right. Are you seeing Latino leaders seizing on this issue, political leaders?
I think the belief is that I'm not a political scientist, but what I think we hear from Latino leaders is very similar to what we hear from most leaders in the center or left of center, and when Latino leaders fall there, I think we hear that from them as well, and that is we have got to have a healthcare system, and we have got to have workplace safety that is fair to all workers. And so if you have Black leaders advocating this for the Black community and Latinos advocating it for the Latino community and white leaders advocating it, what you have is sort of a coming together of people saying, look, when I put the Black lens or the Latino lens or the rural lens on the issue, this is what comes up. But it comes up for every group. That is not a uniquely Latino issue. Worker safety, access to health care, paid sick time is something all workers need. It's exacerbated in the Latino community, and again, I'm speaking only about the Latino community, is because so many Latinos work in low-wage essential jobs, the very jobs that don't have the benefits and protections that we're talking about.
Right. You know, in that Colorado study, an astonishing 50% of all respondents said their economic situation had gotten worse in the last 12 months. You know, high inflation is a part of that, but so is long COVID. This Colorado study, I think, is required reading for all public servants. We've done a number of shows on reproductive rights and the recent Supreme Court decision to return Roe versus Wade and abortion to the states. And in reading this report, protecting reproductive health and abortion rights among the respondents was 3-1, supporting reproductive rights. Nearly 2/3, 61% of the respondents said that they were also more likely to vote for a candidate who supported the expansion of abortion and reproductive rights and health access. And 58% said that the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade made it more likely that they will vote in in November midterm elections. All these issues, long COVID, reproductive rights, they're all intertwined. Why don't we leave the show on that note? Just paint the big picture for us. How is this all intertwined from a socioeconomic perspective?
People have to be healthy. People have to be able to access health care. people have to be assured that they are not going to be in debt for 20 years or lose their home or whittle away their children's college fund or their retirement fund to get health care. If people are not healthy, the society cannot be healthy. And all of this is really forcing us to ask the question, what is it people basically need to be able to take care of their families, to be able to go to work, to be able to productively live in a society and be treated equitably? And how is it that we can ensure everyone has equitable opportunity and equitable access to opportunity? And you fundamentally start with people who are healthy and move forward.
Where can our listeners find out more about your work, Dr. Sugrue?
The Latino Policy Forum. There are a number of pieces, including our report on the socioeconomic impact of COVID, A Path Forward, where there's some specific policy directions. We've also done a recent report on the Great Resignation. It's not the Latinos. And we talk about workplace changes that need to be made to ensure that people are able to work, be safe, and be healthy, and be paid fairly. And if you go to the Latino Policy Forum webpage, latinopolicyforum.org, it's located in Chicago, and it's a pretty easily maneuverable webpage.
Noreen Sugrue, thank you for being our guest today and for bringing this important issue to our listeners. And thank you so much for being with us today. And we will post this on our website, and it will also be at KMUD's archive program. So thanks again for being our guest.
Thank you, Dr. Sugrue.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Sure. We've been speaking with Noreen M. Sugrue, who is currently the Director of Research at the Latino Policy Forum. Prior to joining the forum, she was a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's the author and co-author of several articles and book chapters. Her concerns that she has been trying to address are inequity, inequality, and distributive justice. That's our show today. We'll see you in December. Thank you so much for being with us.
And I want to remind listeners, please become a member and a partner with this station, your community radio. We are a community of informed, involved, progressive people. Please join our community by becoming a member. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.